This is part 20 of Good Omens. The cocoa was a congealed brown sludge half filling the cup. Certain people had spent hundreds of years trying to make sense of the prophecies of Agnes Nutter. They had been very intelligent in the main. Anathema device, who was about to as close to being Agnes as genetic drift would allow, was the best of the bunch, but none of them had been angels. Many people meeting Aziraphale for the first time formed three impressions: that he was English, that he was intelligent, and that he was gayer than a tree full of monkeys on nitrous oxide. Two of these were wrong. Heaven is not in England, whatever certain poets may have thought, and angels are sexless unless they really want to make an effort. But he was intelligent, and it was an angelic intelligence which, while not being particularly higher than human intelligence, is much broader and has the advantage of having thousands of years of practice. Aziraphale was the first angel ever to own a computer. It was a cheap, slow, plasticky one, much touted as ideal for the small businessman. Aziraphale used it religiously for doing his accounts, which were so scrupulously accurate that the tax authorities had inspected him 5 times in the deep belief that he was getting away with murder somewhere. But these other calculations were of a kind no computer could ever do. Sometimes he would scribble something on a sheet of paper by his side. It was covered in symbols with which only 8 other people in the world would have been able to comprehend. 2 of them had won Nobel Prizes, and one of the other 6 dribbled a lot and wasn't allowed anything sharp because of what he might do with it. Anathema lunched on miso soup and pored over her maps. There was no doubt the area around Hadfield was rich in ley lines. Even the famous Reverend Watkins had identified some. But unless she was totally wrong, they were beginning to shift position. She spent the week taking soundings with the theodolite and pendulum, and the Ordnance Survey map of the Tadfield area was now covered with little dots and arrows. She stared at them for some time. Then she picked up a felt-tip pen, and with occasional references to her notebook, began to join them up. The radio was on. She wasn't really listening, so quite a lot of the main news items passed right by her unheeding ears, and it wasn't until a couple of key words filtered down into her conscience that she began to take notice. Someone called a spokesman sounded close to hysteria. "Danger to employees or to the public," he was saying. "And precisely how much nuclear material has escaped?" said the interviewer. There was a pause. "We wouldn't say escaped," said the spokesman. "Not escaped, temporarily mislaid." "You mean it is still on the premise?" "We certainly cannot see how it could have been removed from them," said the spokesman. "Surely you have considered terrorist activity?" There was another pause. Then the spokesman said, in the quiet tones of someone who has had enough and is going to quit after this and raise chickens somewhere, "Yes, I suppose we must. All we need to do is find some terrorists who are capable of taking an entire nuclear reactor out of its can while it's running and without anyone noticing. It weighs about 1,000 tons and is 40 feet high. So they'll be quite strong terrorists. Perhaps you'd like to ring them up, sir, and ask them questions in that supercilious, accusing way of yours." "But you said the power station is still producing electricity," gasped the interviewer. "It is." "How can it still be doing that if it hasn't got any reactors?" You could see the spokesman's mad grin, even on the radio. You could see his pen poised over the farms for sale column in Poultry World. "We don't know," he said. "We are hoping you clever buggers at the BBC would have an idea." Anathema looked down at her map. What she had been drawing looked like a galaxy, or the type of carving she'd seen in the better class of Celtic monolith. The ley lines were shifting. They were forming a spiral. It was centered loosely with some margin for error, but nevertheless centered on Lower Tadfield. Several thousand miles away, at almost the same moment as Anathema was staring at her spirals, the pleasure cruiser Morbili was aground in 300 fathoms of water. For Captain Vincent, this was just another problem. For example, he knew he should contact the owners, but he never knew from day to day or from hour to hour in this computerized world actually who the current owners were. Computers, that was the bloody trouble. The ship's papers were computerized, and it could switch to the most current advantageous flag of convenience in microseconds. Its navigation had been computerized as well, constantly updating its position by satellites. Captain Vincent had explained patiently to the owners, whoever they were, that several hundred square meters of steel plating and a barrel of rivets would be a better investment, and had been informed that his recommendation did not accord with current cost-benefit flow predictions. Captain Vincent strongly suspected that despite all its electronics, the ship was worth more sunk than afloat, and would probably go down as the most perfectly pinpointed wreck in nautical history. By reference, this also meant that he was more valuable dead than alive. He sat at his desk quietly leafing through international maritime codes, whose 600 pages contained brief yet pregnant messages designed to transmit the news of every conceivable nautical eventuality across the world with the minimum of confusion and, above all, cost. What he wanted to say was this: was sailing SSW at position 33 north, 4772 west. First mate, who you may recall was appointed in New Guinea against my wishes, is probably a headhunter, indicated by signs that something was amiss. It appears that quite a vast expanse of seabed has risen up in the night. It contains a large number of buildings, many of which appeared pyramid-like in structure. We are aground in the country yard of one of these. There are some rather unpleasant statues. Amiable old men in long robes and diving helmets have come aboard the ship and are mingling happily with the passengers who think we organized this. Please advise. His questioning finger moved slowly down the page and stopped. Good old international codes. They'd been devised 80 years before, but the men in those days had really thought hard about the kind of perils that might possibly be encountered on the deep. He picked up his pen and wrote down XXXVQVVX. Translated, it meant, have found lost continent of Atlantis. High priest has just won coitus contest. It jolly well isn't. It jolly well is. It isn't, you know. It jolly well is. It isn't all right, then. What about volcanoes? Wensleydale sat back, a look of triumph on his face. What about 'em? Said Adam. All that latter comes up from the center of the earth where it's all hot, said Wensleydale. I saw a program. It had David Attenborough, so it's true. The other of them looked at Adam. It was like watching a tennis match. The hollow earth theory was not going over well in the quarry. A beguiling idea that had stood up to the probings of such remarkable thinkers as Cyrus Red Theed, Bulwer Lytton, and Adolf Hitler was bending dangerously in the wind of Wensleydale's searingly bespectacled logic. I didn't say it was hollow all the way through, said Adam. No one said it was hollow all the way through. It probably goes down miles and miles to make room for all the latter and oil and coal and Tibetan tunnels and such like. But then it's hollow after that. That's what people think. And there's a hole at the North Pole to let the air in. Never seen it on an atlas, sniffed Wensleydale. The government won't let them put it on a map in case people go and have a look in, said Adam. The reason being the people living inside don't want people looking down on them all the time. What do you mean, Tibetan tunnels? Said Pepper. You said Tibetan tunnels. Ah, didn't I tell you about them? Three heads shook. It's amazing, you know. Tibet? They nodded doubtfully. A series of images had risen in their minds. Yak, Mount Everest, people called Grasshopper, little old men sitting on mountains, other people learning kung fu in ancient temples, and snow. Well, you know all those teachers that left Atlantis when it sunk? They nodded again. Well, some of them went to Tibet, and now they run the world. They're called the Secret Masters, on account of being teachers, I suppose. And they've got the secret underground city called Shambhala, and tunnels that go all over the world, so they know everything that goes on and control everything. Some people reckon that they really live under the Gobi Desert, he added loftily, but most competent authorities reckon it's Tibet, all right. Better for the tunneling, anyway. The them instinctively looked down at the grubby, dirt-covered chalk beneath their feet. How come they know everything? Said Pepper. They just have to listen, right? Hazarded Adam. They just have to sit in their tunnels and listen. You know what hearing teachers have. They can hear a whisper right across the room. My granny used to put a glass against the wall, said Brian. She said it was disgusting the way she could hear everything that went on next door. And these tunnels go everywhere, do they? Said Pepper, staring at the ground. All over the world, said Adam firmly. Must have took a long time, said Pepper doubtfully. Remember when we tried digging that tunnel out in the field? We were at it all afternoon, and you had to scrunch up to get all in. Yes, but they've been doing it for millions of years. You can do really good tunnels if you've got millions of years. I thought the Tibetans were conquered by the Chinese and the Dalai Lama had to go to India, said Wensleydale, but without much conviction. Wensleydale read his father's newspaper every evening, but the prosaic everydayness of the world always seems to melt under the powerhouse of Adam's explanations. I bet they're down there now, said Adam, ignoring this. They'd be all over the place by now, sitting underground and listening. They looked at one another. If we dug down quickly, said Brian. Pepper, who was a lot quicker on the uptake, groaned. What you have to go and say that for, said Adam. Fat lot of good us trying to surprise them now, isn't it? With you shouting out everything like that. I was just thinking we could dig down and you just have to go and warn them. I don't think they'd dig all those tunnels, said Wensleydale doggedly. Doesn't make any sense. Tibet's hundreds of miles away. Oh yes, and I suppose you know more about it than Madame Blatinovsky, sniffed Adam. Now, if I was a Tibetan, said Wensleydale in a reasonable tone of voice, I'd just dig straight down to the hollow bits in the earth and then run around the inside and dig straight up where I want it to be. They gave this due consideration. I've got to admit that's more sensible than tunnels, said Pepper. Yes, well, I expect that's what they do, said Adam. They'd be bound to have thought of something as simple as that. Brian stared dreamily at the sky while his finger probed the contents of one ear. Funny, really, he said. You spend your whole life going to school and learning stuff, and they never tell you about stuff like the Bermuda Triangle and UFOs and all these old masters running around the inside of the earth. Why do we have to learn boring stuff when there's all this brilliant stuff we could be learning? That's what I want to know. There was a chorus of agreement. Then they went out and played Charles Fort and the Atlanteans versus the ancient masters of Tibet, and the Tibeters claimed that using mystic ancient lasers was cheating.